Welcome to episode 143 of Silver Lining for Learning at a special time today. And I almost messed that up. I put the wrong time on the image and got Zhao and Kurt and everybody all messed up, but I thankfully corrected it in time. So we are all here today talking about creating open, immersive, relevant, and responsive learning at scale with Ariel, Anbar, my friend and colleague from Arizona State, and Norman Bier from Carnegie Mellon, right? Am I getting that right?
Yes, thanks.
That's right. Okay. And this is a very informal conversation. So Ariel messaged me yesterday saying, "Oh, do we have to prepare for this?" I'm like, "No, just the fact that you've been doing the work that you've been doing. I know some of the work, Ariel, that you've been engaged in at the ETX Center, the Education Through Exploration Center at ASU, and some of this work around sort of open source adaptive learning environments which can work at scale. So I'm just going to open it up, Ariel and Norm, in that order to sort of introduce yourselves briefly. There was an interesting conversation going on with Ariel and Zhao about the other life that Ariel leads, studying life on Earth and other planets. So maybe tell us a little bit about that, but I think we will focus on the education and technology aspects of things. Ariel, on to you.
Sure. So I can start a little bit there. I can tell a story of how I ended up doing education, because so as we were just talking about, I'm trained as a geoscientist. I study ancient Earth history. I use tools and principles of chemistry to do that. And so doing as much work in education as I had been doing the last 10, 15 years was not on my radar screen. But when I moved to ASU, Arizona State University, I took on, it was my first time being faculty at a big public research university, and I took on teaching general chemistry, the large 200-person lecture class. So teaching at that scale the first time, and I did pretty well at it. I actually got a teaching award, but I felt this was a dismal way to teach and a dismal way to learn science. And I started thinking then, surely there are ways that we could build interactive, what now we would call adaptive, personalized learning experiences, the language we use today. At the time it was, can't we use a computer to create something compelling that would respond to what a student does and teach science through data analysis and hypothesis testing and something almost game-like, right? That'd be much more compelling than listening to me lecture 3 times a week. And that started me down a path that led to a number of technological opportunities and experiences, and then funded projects. And then now I run the Center for Education Through Exploration at ASU, which is all about advancing the state of the art of digital learning around the theme of transforming learning, especially science learning, from being mastery of what we know to teaching students the skills of exploration, of examining things that they don't know. It's very constructivist, right? But I came to this as not as somebody who actually knew what the word constructivism even was at the time, but as a practitioner of science and a teaching practitioner looking to see how can we use technology to do things better. And that led down a path that now has me collaborating with Norman, and we'll get into the nuts and bolts of all that soon enough, I'm sure. So that's a quick overview of how I got into what I'm doing a little bit.
That was very rapid. I've got to tell you, I've heard a longer version of the story.
I could give you a longer version.
You self-edited very well there.
Well, I don't know how much Punian folks really want to hear.
That's a good start, Norman. On to you, and then I'm sure we'll circle back to a lot of these things. This is an inquisitive group and a talkative group, so we should be good.
Sure. All right. Let me see if I can do as well in self-editing. So I'm currently at Carnegie Mellon, where I'm the executive director of a thing called the Simon Initiative, and I lead the Open Learning Initiative. CMU does not have a college of education, but we do amazing work in the places where learning science and ed tech intersect. So the Simon Initiative is intended to put an umbrella over that work, named for Herb Simon, who is probably the closest thing that Carnegie Mellon has to a patron saint, although he would have been horrified to hear himself referred to as a saint. So Simon Initiative is really intended to put an umbrella across this. The Open Learning Initiative fits under that umbrella. And I got here through a fairly roundabout path. I actually started off as a humanities guy, did my undergraduate in English literature, did my graduate work at CMU in philosophy, and in a very strong tradition for Western philosophers, then realized that I needed to do something to pay my rent. Ended up connecting with an organization originally called Carnegie Technology Education, eventually became iCarnegie. So this was a spin out from CMU back in 1999. Peak of the dot-com boom. No one can hire software developers. There just aren't enough of them out there in the world, particularly since most universities are very focused on training computer scientists and not software engineers. And so iCarnegie was intended to take a tremendous amount of expertise at CMU, which was serving a very small population, build this into a series of online curricula that could be offered by faculty at other institutions, and really use this to try to address the shortcomings in the marketplace. And so I started teaching with that courseware, was eventually invited to join the company and help to develop the courseware, refine, eventually train the faculty that were going to be using this. So this is a really interesting experience for me. I think in many ways, 1999 was too soon to be building courseware. The technology wasn't quite there. And so when I think now about what we have access to and what we could have done differently 20 years ago, my mind's kind of blown. But it was an important experience for me as well, because the organization was very focused on reviewing the data that their courses were producing and trying to understand what it told them about where the courses could be better. With my English degree, I was not particularly an astute student of statistics. And so to suddenly see statistics being used in this practical way that I could immediately take and make actionable blew my mind. It was amazing. And that has led to the next 20 years of work where we really think seriously about what are the data that our coursewares can be producing? What do they tell us about students' knowledge state? What do they tell us about our learning model and where it's effective and where we can do better? And that ends up just being a central theme in my work today and for a lot of the past 2 decades. Not as crisp as you are, Ariel.
No, but I haven't heard that story, so I didn't actually realize for some reason. Now a lot makes sense to me now, because I didn't realize that you started a philosophy major. But neither of us started education, right, as our thing, right?
No, we both came to it from the side.
Yeah, well, we did a bunch of episodes around people working in education in India, and what was hilarious was every one of our guests, and I think there were like 8 of them over 3 episodes or more, all of them had backgrounds in engineering before they all moved into education, which is which is the true of me as well, for that matter. But just to kick us off, Ariel, maybe you can tell us a little bit about the kind of work that you do at the ETX Center, because there's a range of things that you do there, and then maybe segue that to the work that you and Norman have been doing now around sort of the open source stuff, and then we'll open it up to questions from the rest of the hosts.
Sure. So as a geoscientist, geochemist, wanting to teach science better, the natural things that my brain went to initially were sort of place-based learning, right? And using technology to sort of virtually bring people to locations that are scientifically important and teach them through that. In particular, Young and I were talking about earlier, right? I'm funded by the NASA astrobiology program. My research is my science research, and the astrobiology program is very interested in helping us understand what the Earth was like at different times in the past. And so we go to field sites that most even scientists will never go to, let alone the average person. And so finding ways to capture that place and bring people there virtually and then teach them science, and not just science, but I'm an educator, also the process of science, right? Through the place-based exploration was a very central thing. So we started making virtual field trips using sort of 2.5D technology. So not true VR, but spherical images that you put on a website and explore and interact. And we, so this is the path I went down initially before we had the center. And we realized pretty quickly that, it's great to make this gee whiz kind of environment, but this is kind of obvious, I'm sure, once you think about it, but we didn't really think about it, we just did, right? And we realized, oh, well, we need a lesson plan, right? We can't just put students in here and expect that they'll learn anything, right? So then we're making like paper lesson plans to like guide the students through stuff and to give to teachers to guide students through these experiences. And we realized, well, that's kind of ridiculous. We have this very high tech product and we're using paper and pencil and relying on the teacher to like guide the student through it. Can't we put the guidance in the experience, right? With what I now would call adaptive feedback, right? With questions that the student has to answer, they get feedback that guides them through and tutors them through, anticipates their misconceptions to help clarify things and so on. And so we started doing that. That got us connected with a company in Australia called Smart Sparrow, which was no longer exists, but it was a little painful, but it was a startup company that was building one of the early sort of commercialized intelligent tutoring systems. sort of rule-based adaptive feedback. And their particular focus was around simulations. And what their CEO, who's a brilliant guy, Dror Ben Naim, had realized, he also started as a physicist who then went into education. He started by building simulations for faculty, for engineering faculty, to teach engineering concepts. And he would build these things sort of on contract for them on the side as like a side hustle. And they would use it and then stop. And he'd ask them, why did you stop using it? And they said, well, you know, I used it once, it was okay, but I wanted to change this and this and this and this, and the feedback and the logic, and I didn't have any more money to pay you anymore. So then he had this idea to abstract the logic from the simulation, right? Build a simulation with an API behind it that could then talk to a platform that where the logic and all the feedback could be set up by the professor and a teaching assistant. So you have a programmer build a simulation, which is kind of complicated and requires skills that a typical professor and teaching assistant don't have, but have the logic layer be developed by the teachers, right? The educators, who are the ones who have that logic, right? And so that became his dissertation. That became the foundation of that company. That was exactly what we needed as people who were developing these virtual field trips and wanted to figure out how to give tours through them, right? But didn't want to hire a programmer to build a one-shot tour thing, right? That then we'd have to keep going back to them every time we wanted to refine it. So we started meshing virtual field trips with this adaptive technology layer. And that led us then down the path of doing other things, not just field trips, but also simulation-based learning. We started building modules. We built a few whole courses. We got funding from the Gates Foundation and from NASA to do these sorts of things. And so that's what the center does. We build the core thing of our center, the core expertise, to get back to what Punya asked me to talk about. The core expertise is we're a learning design shop, grant funded almost entirely, that builds learning experiences that are of the sort I described around simulations and virtual field explorations for sort of middle school, high school, and college, higher ed, depending on the project. And I'll get to how we connected with Norman, right? So we were working with Smart Sparrow, and that was a great relationship, but probably not as good a relationship as you can get between a university and a startup company. That interfaces can be fraught, right? But Dror had his heart in the right place, and the company in general was doing all the right things in that scenario. But it got to the point finally where investors got impatient and they forced him to exit. So almost exactly 3 years ago, just over 3 years ago, just at the start of the pandemic, Pearson buys Smart Sparrow because the investors said, you got to sell this. We want to get what we can out of it. We've lost too much money. And so then Pearson has first of all, we have no interest in being dependent on Pearson. Secondly, Pearson has no interest in marketing this platform. They bought Sparrow for its technology. There's this saying in ed tech, Pearson is where good technology goes to die. And that, that's probably the case. So they bought it for the underlying tech to infuse it in their product. So we had to figure out what we're going to do. We have all this installed base. We have courses offered at ASU. We have millions of dollars of grants, especially from NASA, to build stuff. And our platform suddenly is going away. We thought briefly about building our own platform, and then decided that was probably, well, actually, it wasn't silly. We thought about building our own platform, and the philosophy we had, and this is important because this is why Norman and I are working together. The philosophy that I had is I'm only willing to do one platform transition. And what does that mean? It means I'm not going to go to another for-profit startup company kind of a platform, and I don't want to be dependent on a publisher. We have to go to something that's open source. And so we thought, maybe we should build our own platform and make it open source. How about that as an idea? And this is going to be a big philosophy, and what we're going to talk about Norman and I have this passionate agreement, this violent agreement that the infrastructure, right, where this kind of learning has to be open source for reasons we can get into. And so we started down the path of exploring what it would take to do that. And that led us to Norman, because it turned out that the Open Learning Initiative, which Norman leads, had just embarked on a path to rebuild a new generation, to build a new generation of the platform that it needed for its projects that would be an open source platform. And so we kind of joined forces. So Norman can elaborate on that.
Perfect.
Yeah,
Norman. Yep.
Sure. So, and I will lead off by telling you, I absolutely did not want to build another platform. In 25 years in this space, this will be my 5th platform. Tried to avoid building it, but let's talk about why we needed it. So, I took over leading the Open Learning Initiative about 10 years ago, and was really lucky to inherit an organization that just had a tremendous history behind it and had tremendous work from amazing people. And to just give them credit here. So, Bill Jerome, Ross Strader, John Rinderly, Renee Fisher, and most importantly, Candace Till, built OLI as an organization that was able to simultaneously really see the application of learning science in building these online learning environments, while also leaving space to continue to do fresh research. And the real tribute to their work is in looking at the results. The underlying research that demonstrates the courses that they're building are courses that are demonstrably enacting instruction for students. And so they've got an amazing process, got an amazing platform. But on the one hand, the process really involves taking a learning engineer, taking someone who has deep expertise, both in the learning science side, but also the technology side, going to have them work very closely with a subject matter expert, faculty member, translate these the ideas that our domain expert has into learning designs. And then they're going to spend some serious time taking those learning designs and handcrafting XML pages that get loaded into a server. And just sort of straight off the bat, this process strikes me as a terrible use of expertise. When I've got these highly trained experts creating XML files, it makes me shudder to think of how their time is being spent. But the process also ends up leaving a lot of faculty who might be really interested in developing and refining these types of courseware out in the cold, because a lot of folks don't want to see their results translated out, by someone else. They want to get in and work on these things themselves. And so it seems pretty clear to me that one of the things that OLI needed, if we were really going to live up to this promise of building a larger community of research and practice, were better tools to directly engage authors in both developing and then reviewing the data and refining their courseware. And so one of the first questions that we have is, how can we do that? How can we build the tools that will allow us to do that? Turns out building those tools is really challenging when you are working on a then 12-year-old platform that was built on what had once been cutting-edge Java enterprise software, but which it turns out is really hard to stay on top of, given the constraints of modern technologies. And so my team really started looking hard at, okay, what comes next? This platform that we lovingly call now the legacy platform, or OLI, is doing a reasonable job of serving a larger population that had been designed to do, but it's getting increasingly hard to maintain, and it's really hard to expand and get into this new space that we care about. So we look around to see what else is there. Are there other platforms? Are there other efforts that we might think about that can do what OLI does? Took a hard look at a lot of platforms, including the Open edX platform. But it turns out that there just aren't, that the kind of nuances that we care about, the kind of semantic context that we want to capture about our course design, kind of wrapping of learning outcomes and skills with our assessments are things that other platforms don't support. And eventually we set off on an effort to say, no, if we've got to do this, we've got to actually stand up a platform from scratch, which leads us to this question of, how do we want to do this? When we review where OLI has been successful and where we've seen challenges, the fact that we're publishing open course content on a closed platform, really led us to some sort of philosophic challenges, but also some challenges out in the space. And it seemed like, both in terms of where we wanted courseware to go, but also in terms of sort of living up to our ideals, that the only way to really make this new platform work was to begin building it and publishing it out in the open, to really use this as a foundation for a larger open community, with the goal that we can start to bring on board a larger population who can buy into this idea of science-informed, iterative, data-based instruction, improvement, and research. And so in 2020, we launched our effort, a new platform that we called Taurus, T-O-R-U-S. My Western Pennsylvania accent often turns that into Taurus, the bull, no bulls. And we launched this effort just in time for a global pandemic, which was about the time that Ariel and I started talking.
So
Chris,
let me jump in here. Some of our audience may not be familiar with engineering learning, but that is a concept that started with Herb Simon. And it took only half a century for higher education to begin doing it, which is really pretty impressive when you think about it, that it was that quick. Hopefully we can do better in the future. And there's a lot of exciting work going on in engineering learning. We're planning a show in the next couple months where 3 of the people involved with the Learning Engineering Toolkit will come on and talk specifically about that work and why it's exciting and how it's a mechanism for personalization. But I'm hearing 2 things, and I'm interested in your thoughts about how they connect with one another and how they're separate from one another. One of them is that open source, having a powerful open source platform that allows people to author their own material. And that certainly is a welcome advance. The other is actually developing experiences for active learning based on the learning sciences, as opposed to using open source platforms for teaching by telling and learning by listening. And engineering learning in a powerful way, because you can do a lot more with personalization when people's actions second by second are being captured than you can when people are clicking on a quiz, or how long did you watch the video for, and all of the classic kinds of LMS metrics that are really pretty weak. So I'm curious as to whether you try to link those two, or whether it's just sort of, here's this open source platform, you can author your own things, and then off to the side, here's this wonderful way of transforming the learning process itself, and we hope you'll look at it.
So I think that's a great question. I'm going to give a real quick answer to it from my perspective, but I'm actually interested in Ariel's take at this point, because we've gone back and forth on these pieces for the past few years now. Wow. My own sense is that traditional OLI development takes a very heavy-handed approach in ensuring that we are developing experiences that are as well engineered as we can make them, and that are designed to be iteratively improved through an engineering experience. We have sort of learned that not everyone is going to dive that deeply into the learning engineering pool. And so our goal in building Taurus was to try to create an environment where anyone can jump in and begin constructing an experience, likely based on their own intuition, but where we want to encourage them to treat that design as a hypothesis. This is the way that we think students will achieve this learning outcome. One of the first steps in that is to make sure that your experiment has, it's gathering enough data to actually, test your hypothesis. And so some of our initial tools in Taurus are a set of auditing tools that aren't going to force our authors to do things, but we're going to encourage you to say, look, you've got this learning outcome. Looks like you're only giving 2 practice opportunities. That's probably not enough to really test. Why not add a few more? But then let them get this experience out into the classroom, and then show them the data about how students are actually performing, and encouraging them to iterate. So we think about this as scaffolding up to an engineering process. And I think one of the reasons this is important, frankly, is that we just have so many thoughtful and innovative educators out there. The notion that we're going to build the one perfect statistics course is crazy. If someone comes in and says, you know what, I think I've got a better way of teaching mean and median, I want to see it, build it, let's get it out there, let's test it. And if the data are coming back and saying what you've just built is really doing better for your students, let's make that more widely available. If it's not, let's encourage you to tweak it and better understand why it's not working.
So that's a great answer. I'll elaborate just a little bit, or add just a little bit. So to the last point, right, the tweak, might be, it's the same way of teaching a statistical concept, but maybe you contextualize it differently, right, for different learning communities, for different audiences, right? And that can make a powerful difference. I mean, even just something as simple as representation, if you're dealing with diverse audiences, right? Getting the representation right, getting an example right, right? So the underlying logic of the teaching may be unchanged, right? Because it is a good pedagogical practice that's already wired into a lesson, but it's not going to work with my students unless I make these changes, right? So we definitely part of the philosophy here, we want open source because we want the instructors or institutions that create these things to be able to own the thing and not be, subject to the whims of some underlying owner of the platform IP, right? But the other part of that is we want to encourage them to build their own stuff, and then so that means two things, right? One, as Norman talked to, is make it easy for them to be able to run essentially experiments, right? See what works better than something else. The other is that once you are creating authoring tools of any sort, you're making design choices. It's constrained, right? It's not a blank canvas where you can do anything. There's certain kinds of interactions that are allowed and others that aren't in the toolkit, right? And so right away, we are kind of creating a scaffold and it's implicitly a set of templates that hopefully are guiding towards good learning practice. And then, what we find most instructors, right, confronted with this whole concept have no idea what to do, right? They kind of get conceptually this is powerful, but they don't know what to do. So if we give examples that they start off with, and again, we're going in the direction of building a very simplified learning tool where we're going to be giving them templates to begin with, learning design tool that's wired into the platform. So they can, here's a template for a type of learning progression with a certain set of feedbacks. Layer your content in there, right? Layer what you're trying to teach in there and then make tweaks around that design. So we're already starting with what's hopefully a good pedagogical design with kinds of interactions that learning engineering would tell us are good if they're implemented well.
So the subtext there is that the platform is opinionated, right? It's not strictly opinionated. It doesn't have such a strong opinion that it's not going to let you experiment. But we do walk into this with some thoughts, hopefully based on science, of what's going to make for a more effective experience.
And part of the fun of this collaboration, both personally, I think between me and Norman, but also our teams, because we both have very large teams behind us, and they really enjoy working with each other, is because we're coming at it from different perspectives. I mean, we're practitioners, have ideas of this is how we want to teach. Why can't the software do this? And Norman's team comes from this very deep engineering background of saying, well, here are the right ways to teach. Let's help you figure out how to do that. And so that's been a really interesting interaction. And since nobody's trying to, come up with special secrets to cart away and make money off of, it's a great kind of exchange that's very, very use directed, right? We're all very goal directed and actually trying to build things that we're putting in front of students. That's the focus always.
Pastors,
not academic. Yeah.
So before you jump in, quick question, Ariel, Norman. How much of this is built now? How many sort of ballpark courses or people are using it? I'm just curious.
So the platform exists, and the platform that exists is now a bit of a hybrid. There's the core platform that Norman's team set out to build, and then there's a whole infrastructure on top of that to support the kind of simulation-based learning that we came in wanting to do. That now exists as a real platform that has, at ASU we have a number of courses, a few thousand students a year now going through courses that are sitting on that platform, which for ASU is not big scale, but for other places that's a lot of students. So we're maturing fast, right? We're finding, the bugs are being found and edge cases are being exposed, and we have a lot of stress about that. And then at OLI, Norman can comment on the migration of their user base. But we had no choice here on our end. There's no legacy platform left. We had a 2-year grace period from Pearson, and that ended last summer. And so we moved all the ASU courses, as well as there's something called the InSpark Science Network, which is something that we have here out of ASU that serves up the courseware that we build to universities around the country. So there's some, at this point, 20 to 30,000 students out there in courses that are now sitting on Taurus.
Cool.
And Taurus has currently, we know of 3 production instances of Taurus that are out in the world. That the instance that ASU is running on, we've got the instance at Carnegie Mellon, which sits at proton.oli.cmu.edu. Anyone can jump in, create an account. We also have an instance that's being hosted by KTH, Royal Technical Institute of Sweden, and they've got tens of thousands of enrollments that are happening there. So we really are seeing the platform being used very robustly, both for fresh course creation, for some migrated courses that had come over from Open edX in the case of KTH, Smart Sparrow, our friends at ASU. Sort of ironically, we've actually at OLI been the slowest to migrate our legacy courses, in part because we've been trying to help out friends who have been under stricter deadlines. And so we have some thousands of enrollments that are happening primarily at Carnegie Mellon for newly created or Taurus native courses. We're in the process of migrating our legacy courses and expect to have most of them in place for the fall. And we're also seeing lots and lots of development of small modules and small courses for experimentation. Particularly our learning engineering program, the Metals Master's program at CMU, students have been creating many small modules for simple experiments. And so if anyone's interested in checking this out on the YouTube channel, I think folks are sharing out the URLs for our production system on Proton, but also the GitHub site where anyone can go and take a look at the code and hopefully contribute back to it.
So this is actually quite fabulous to get scientists into education. You know, I have not seen many educators become another geochemist. You know, so that has not happened yet. You know, so well, I might, but you know, after another 50 years. So I was just wondering, you know, because when there's a really, I don't know, you know, how to frame this question, but I want you guys to discuss this because the diversity of students, because I was thinking about Charles Darwin. He probably did not really take a course from anyone, and then he kind of invented his own way of exploration. I was also thinking about Steve Jobs, you know, did the same thing. So there are students who are kind of anti-curriculum, anti-pedagogy. Do you see what I mean, right? So because I think sometimes an instructor, a course could be limiting the students' creativity, imagination, right? Because by, you know, there's so much knowledge we have right now, you know, with the new thing, ChatGPT can manufacture a lot even more in every minute, every second is doing crazy stuff. So I guess I'm just interested in, how do you guys view students? Because right now, so far, you've talked quite a lot about what you want to teach, how you want to teach, you create a course, you create a module. But what if students said, okay, how do you, because in a blog, Punya put together, you talk about personalized learning. How do you enable each individual student to construct their own learning on the platform? So that was really what I guess come down to say, what if you get a great inventor said, you know, I do this really fast, I pick and choose, I won't do this, you know. So I don't know if I made a question, but that was something I want to discuss with you guys about, you know, the overwhelming past literature in any field, and also the new invention of potential students in the future. So how do we accommodate that, you know, just not only your platform, any learning platform. And by the way, I'm very so happy, Ariel, you guys quit working with the Pearson. That's a good decision.
Norman, you want to take that from the philosophy angle, or?
Sure.
It's almost a philosophical question about a basic approach, right?
And so I guess I'm going to start off, I'll give you three different kinds of answers. And the first is that Charles Darwin's, Steve Jobs of the world, the autodidacts are always going to be able to go out and learn on their own, right? In many ways, the students that we're most interested in, the students that I'm most interested in supporting, are the ones that can't just go out and craft their own learning experience on the fly. That said, I think that in the open education community, there's been some real interest in what are the affordances of openly licensed content to allow students and encourage students to get more involved in the co-creation of learning resources and thus the co-creation of the learning process. We've been lucky to do some work in that space recently with a grant from the state of California Learning Labs project, and now from the National Science Foundation, where we've got the PhD student doing some deep investigation into learner sourcing. So how do we actively engage students both in the co-creation of content, but also in coming back and commenting on and giving us input into the larger learning model. You know, I think one of the most basic but profound insights from learning science in the past 2 decades is that novice learners have a very different perspective than we experts. Shout out to Ken Kadinger at home, who gives us this notion. And and in getting them to come in and explain what they're seeing in the learning model, we're unpacking and starting to see that novice perspective. So I think that's pretty important. But I think the last piece is that, when we look at the evolution of the post-World War II American university, what we see is a place of increasing diversity, and attempts to address that diversity really have been one of the major challenges that we see in American post-secondary education. And so thinking carefully about how we build learning environments that sort of by definition are going to support diverse learners who are coming at these courses with different kinds of prior knowledge, different kinds of experience, is really at the heart of what we're doing, and is, I think, at the heart of one of our current collaborations.
So I don't disagree with anything, Norman. I rarely disagree about anything, so not surprising. But let me give you some concrete examples for me as a teacher, right? So and we'll go back to the field-based kind of scenarios that sort of got me into this, right? So if I take a student to the Grand Canyon and put them at the bottom of the Grand Canyon on their own, right? There is some distribution of things that will happen, right? And there will be some students who will learn the history of the Grand Canyon that way without any guidance. They'll they come with just enough prior knowledge and a lot of logic, and they'll be all excited and they'll figure things out, right? Most of us, that wouldn't happen. Most of us would pretty quickly be thinking about, how do I get my lunch? How do I shield myself from the sun? I don't have any idea what I'm looking at, and I can't figure this out myself, right? They need a guide, right? And they need scaffolding and they need structure. And so, and we really went into this with the idea initially of let's build these virtualized versions of the location, and then we realized, but most students can't learn that way, right? We need to provide this guidance somehow in the experience, and that's what led us down this path. But so I agree in my heart, what I'd love to do is give people very free reign, but most of us need some kind of structure and some kind of tutoring. And so that's really why we ended up down this path. And as constricted, and I would say our current generation of things are pretty constricted, right? But as constricted as they are, because there is a lot of formative feedback, it allows for the creation of experiences that are at least more exploratory than sitting in a lecture or reading a book and just having to follow what I'm being told, right? So it is so I see what we're doing as a step in the direction. But there are things we can do now that are where students can really bring their own meaning. And so I'll give you an example again, just sticking to sort of the place-based stuff. So we have this rich expertise at this point on the team of building these virtual environments. And one of the things we wanted to do is to figure out how can we make it possible for the teacher, the educator, the instructor to create their own virtual field trip. And then once we started thinking about that, it was a very small step to think, well, what if we could have it possible for the student to create their own virtual field trip in some sort of technology infrastructure that would mash up with their learning management system, so what the student does in there gets scored, and it can actually be part of a formal curriculum. And so we've been developing a tool that does exactly that, something called Tourit. I'll stick a link in the URL. So it can be a very user-friendly tool for using a cell phone to create spherical images, which is not that hard, and then slap it into this tool that then allows you to then layer in other information there. It doesn't give you the full adaptivity, and we haven't lashed it to Taurus yet, but there's a vision of lashing it to Taurus, right? So that what could happen in the future is a student can actually build a guided tour, right, with adaptive formative feedback, right, in an environment of their choosing, with information that they decide, right? And so that's that will be a big step that I think we're actually very close to being able to realize. I mean, we don't have funding for that particular thing, but we can see, and the pieces are all there, right, that would go in the direction you're talking about.
So I just want to jump in. I know Chris and others want to jump in. That's a beautiful answer. So I'm just really, I was thinking about Florida, the education situation in Florida, right now, what's happening in Florida, take out courses. Because what I was really imagining is anything that's built by the authority and can be challenged. Okay, and how do we invite that kind of challenge into a learning platform or a learning environment in like schools or university, any place? I think it's kind of essential in this new age right now, because we have authoritative, ideas, a lot of authority. So also we are looking for universe to break our path, into the future. So anyway, that just thanks, guys. That was That was more of a random thought in that anything else because of my conversation with Ariel about Western Australia started that. Thank you.
Go ahead, Kurt.
So I have to say I was smiling a few times when Norm was speaking earlier. I'll just reflect back on a couple quick stories, Norman. When I entered graduate school in 1986 at Wisconsin in January, I had a course with Rich Lair, a brilliant guy, and he had a knock on the door in class, and there was a guy that walked into the room, and he ignored the class, and he left the room, and he escorted the person at the door and gave him some instructions. And we found out later that the guy at the door, real kind of tall compared to me, was Ken Cadinger. And Ken Cadinger was too smart to go to Wisconsin. He was sending him to Carnegie Mellon. And he's been there ever since. He was apparently a very brilliant guy. And, we had the #1 ed psych program in the country, but he was brilliant beyond that, so that's story number one. And 4 years later, when I was a faculty member at West by God, Virginia University, Linda Flower and Dick Hayes and I and several others ran a symposia or colloquia for the day on computer-supported collaborative writing technologies, because they had the Center for the Study of Writing. And we went off to lunch at Carnegie Mellon, and they pointed out this guy a few tables over named Herb Simon, who I had read verbal reports as data and other things. And I made the big mistake of not introducing myself to him. But so a couple of Carnegie Mellon stories. And of course, University of Pittsburgh down the road from me handles a lot of the, ed psych, learning science related grants and issues and so forth. Anyways, about 9 years later, I did like you and got involved in developing online courseware and whatnot. And I wish I would have known then what I know now, just like what you had said. But I was building sharing tools, 8 of them: course share, publication share, training share, quiz share, survey share, bookstore share, university share, on and on and on and on. Spending a lot of money that I wish I would have spent in other ways, investing in real estate in Tempe, Arizona, or Las Vegas, somewhere else anyways. But I learned my lesson. I'm never going to build software again. And 9 years after that, I decided to write a book about this open world, and it's called The World is Open: How Web Technology is Revolutionizing Education. I also wrote an article about open source, the movement of open source from North America to China. It became a 2-part paper that was published in IRODL. But I interviewed Candace Teal at Carnegie Mellon for that World is Open book. And I was also involved with the Hewlett Foundation grants with they had funded a lot of open source and a lot of open courseware, and the OLI initiative got huge monies from Hewlett. I was working with the open source, open courseware prototype system, which was translating MIT contents to Chinese. And my friend Lucifer Chu donated $500,000 of the money he made from translating Lord of the Rings to translate MIT open courseware and other kinds of things. So I was having fun in that, just interviewing wonderful people doing open courseware and creating open access to education and open source software. Well, my question for you and for Ariel is, if I was to repeat what I did back in 2009, interviewing all the people in the open ed movement who are movers and shakers, and to write a part 2 of that book, who would you recommend that I talk to now? I want to write the book, The World is Wide Open Now. So I really do want to write this. Who's doing innovative things today that are on the scale of what we saw happening in the 2000s? Who's impressive? Smart Sparrow's gone. Who's still around? Who survived? And who's going to survive the bank fallout in Silicon Valley? Okay.
We did.
I will interview you undoubtedly. So, who's impressive to you? What conferences do you attend where the people meet up, where folks like you all tend to gravitate to, that you might recommend to our listeners out there, or viewers in YouTube right now? Who should they pay attention to? Both of you. I'd like to hear it.
That's a big question.
Yeah.
And some of these names are going to be the same. I think that Kim Thanos and David Wiley continue to do tremendous work, both in open and in science-informed education.
David's been on the show. David's been on the show.
Some folks who have continued to be deeply involved with instructional design, but and learning engineering, but maybe less focused on open. I think I would drag Ross Strader in as someone who was who's now at Cisco, but who was present at the creation. That's what I say. I think Delmar Larson at UC Davis has really been making a splash with what's just an incredibly strong commitment to open, and has really been doing some interesting things. What's emerging from the edX sale to 2U and what's going to be happening next at MIT and Harvard, I think is interesting. I think there's a whole cadre of folks there. Philip Schmidt's the person to start with, but all of the folks that he's going to be talking with. But I think that what's interesting now, 20 years later, is that in many ways, there's no one place or person or conference I can point to, because we've started to see open education and that commitment to OER start to really permeate, right? Every institution that you go to, almost any, whether it's in the libraries, whether it's in their ed tech space, you've got, or whether it's just an individual faculty member, it feels like we now have folks who are aware of OER and are taking advantage of it. I think that the continuing Open Ed conference continues to be an incredibly strong place, maybe stronger after the pandemic than heading into it. I think that the virtual approach has been really strong. And so, there's that entire team. Just read through their list of the current board of directors, and those are all folks to talk to. Ariel, where were you going to send folks?
I would just add one other name that I'm sure you just forgot, Rich Bruniak, right? OpenStax. I mean, they have figured out a model to get through various things. I'll take it a bit abstract. There's an inherent tension that we feel and experience between the open movement, as it currently tends to be constituted often, and the attempt to build more sophisticated, interactive experiences with formative feedback, that need to sit on cloud servers and need technology teams behind them to keep them evolving and moving, right? Which inevitably are not free, right? And somebody somehow has to pay. And it's more expensive and complicated, right, than serving a PDF, open text, right? And the various folks we talked to, like Delmar, right, has his solution to it, which seems to be heroic work on his part personally, and on the part of his team. By which I mean, Delmar always seems to be on the edge of burning himself out. OpenStax has figured out some kind of, I don't know. I mean, they're very heavily, I think, grant funded. They now have the Gates Foundation coming in and deciding to support them as a public good. So Delmar is trying to make things somewhat more sophisticated. There's definitely, it's more that, there's more than just adapted PDF text there. OpenStax has played with that more than played. I think they backed off because they saw the cost. So I think there's an inherent challenge in the open movement of figuring out, well, how do we come up with a model that maybe is not free, but is low cost? And again, this is why we come back to open source as being at least a big part of that solution, right? At least let's take away people trying to extract dollars from the technology platform itself and have that be an at cost thing, somehow supported by a community effort.
Yeah, Rich and David are both interviewed in the first book, and Rich would be a good person to have on this show, I think, with the OpenStax project. So that's a name I'll put down on the side for a future show. I'm sorry, Norm, you're going to say something.
I'd like to build on that. I think that friction in the open education space between the costs of effectiveness, particularly when we look at these more sophisticated platforms, and this goal of free and open access is one that we just haven't seen folks being willing to jump in and take on, right? And I don't think there's any one right answer to it, but I think that sometimes it's a conflict that hasn't been productive, that folks haven't been engaged in that conversation in a productive way. But I think as important to me as the work that's happening with that question of access versus effectiveness is also the recognition that to develop and to continue to refine these kinds of OER materials is actually tremendous effort and tremendous investment from just thousands of educators and faculty members. And most of the time, this is completely uncompensated labor. And this is just, it's really problematic. If the expectation is that we're going to sustain the open education movement on the backs of uncompensated faculty members, too often contingent faculty members, and that these are the folks that are just going to take on the extra responsibility of building and writing and refining this stuff, we haven't actually solved a problem. We've created a new one. And I don't have a perfect solution to any of these. I think that the best solution we found so far has been to create a system where the development and improvement of these materials and the platforms that they sit on are really the shared work of not-for-profit higher education, and that we try to keep those costs as low as possible and share them out in ways that they can benefit the largest number of students, but acknowledge that there are real costs there.
Well, thank you for that. I think Chris wants to jump in.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the time, Chris. So, I think there's a question from Dodgy as well. If you can weave that in, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'll be quick. Jim Goodell, who is someone who will be part of the future episode on engineering learning that we'll have in the next couple months, has been active in the chat, making a number of comments, and his comments and my thinking remind me of that there's a kind of convergence taking place among different projects that are working towards the same goal, and now they have the potential to really empower each other. So I'm the Associate Director for Research of the National AI Institute for Adult Learning and Online Education. Among other things, the kinds of intelligent AI assistants that we're building, both for instruction and potentially for learning by doing, can just hook up to what's going on and help to make a difference, help to make it easier. On the platform side, Copilot in GitHub, may open up some possibilities in terms of more rapid programming that will empower the platform. So it's interesting to think about the ways that generative AI, without doing any magic, without somehow becoming sentient, may be able to empower some of what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, I'm, as you can imagine, probably many of you the same thing. The first thing I started doing with ChatGPT was seeing how well could this work as a tutoring system, right? And the first thing I found, after being amazed at the quality of the superficial quality of answers, I was amazed at how much easily it got things wrong that I figured it should get right, right? And so, okay, so now what do we do? So that's something we've certainly been talking about here at ASU with some folks. Norman and I have talked about it a little bit. I think we've been, in the short term, we've all been drowning in all sorts of short-term tactical things related to our immediate projects. But there's immense potential there if we can figure out how to navigate the pitfalls. And so there are ideas around that. Norman, you probably want to talk a little about?
I feel like there's so much conversation around the possibilities and peril of generative AI that I'm not actually sure I have a lot to add right now.
Okay. All right.
But I'm also looking at our time. So, there's real possibilities.
Funny because, I asked it to create, write mathematical puzzles in the style of Lewis Carroll. And what was amazing was how much it got the superficial style, the verbal style, the linguistic style of Lewis Carroll, right? But all its puzzles were wrong. It was hilarious. And I would say, the math is wrong. It's, I am so sorry. Here is another one, so polite, and then get it completely wrong again. And it was just fun. But again, there was another one conversation I had where I tried to get it to explain why when you multiply two negative numbers, you get a positive number. And that actually was kind of fun. I mean, we finally ended up at a point where it described that, multiplying by a negative number is equivalent to rotation by 180 degrees. So if you multiply twice and on the number line, you end up pointing the same way, forget the value. I mean, it was, and you could see the glimmer of what it can be if, and only if it gets some content knowledge in there. Because right now it's floating in sort of a miasma of words, which have no referent to the real world, to any kind of content knowledge. It's just interesting.
Yeah, what scares me is how few people seem to understand what these platforms are really designed to do. I mean, it's not It's not designed to be a search engine, not designed to serve. I mean, the technology fundamentally is not designed to serve up information. It's designed to give you plausible responses to prompts. Plausible, so that's what the technology is fundamentally designed to do. And that's all it's, unless you start lashing it to other things, it's never going to do more than that. And so I get very scared when I see, you guys have news readers too that probably serve up things on certain things you're interested in. I'm obviously interested in generative AI. I see a lot of, ed literature and stuff like that, not professional literature, but, magazine articles and things like that. And, people are advised to use this as a shortcut for your research, for example, and it's like, no, but you got to, it can be if you use it very carefully, right?
Right.
Things like that. And it's just,
Yeah, my colleagues tell me that prompt engineering is actually going to be the next big space, that especially after GPT-4 comes out, we're going to see this fresh round of excitement and things, but that really the magic is going to be in engineering prompts in such a way that we get useful and correct answers rather than just entertaining, but sometimes confidently wrong ones.
maybe.
I wrote this blog post recently because I was reading this essay written by Harry Frankfurt, I think the philosopher, which is called On Bullshit, which he made into a book. And he sort of has this distinction between bullshit and lying, and talks about how a liar is actually working in the same space as the person who's telling the truth. They are at least in that continuum, while a bullshitter is actually just out to persuade and fill the airwaves with nonsense. And then I sort of wrote this analogy. I can drop the link there, or you can just go to my website. And that ChatGPT-3 is the ultimate bullshit artist in that philosophically technical term of bullshit. And it's a kind of a provocative way of thinking about it, but that's exactly what it is. It just fills up one word after the other.
What's
amazing to me is careful, Punya. We're going to get our FCC license taken away from us.
No, I use
what's amazing.
Technical way as a philosopher did.
Yeah, what's amazing is how often it gets things right. I mean, that's actually the remarkable thing.
Absolutely.
So when you understand what it actually is designed to do, it's amazing that with a few thousand words of context and then the predictive capacity with the statistical model out across the internet, you end up with something that seems so reasonable most of the time. That's the kind of mind-blowing thing. And even experts in AI who I've talked to said that was kind of, it reached some scale, right, where it surprises them that it works so well, right? But inherently it's flawed. And let me just say one other thing. So the problem with prompt engineering is when you think about using this as a tutor, we're not going to train our students to be prompt engineers when they're fumbling around trying to understand what the mole is in chemistry and how to use it, right? And so the system has to be able to handle badly phrased prompts and understand what the student's trying to get at and give them good information to be a really effective tutor of our dreams, right? So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just want to.
No, that's okay. I was using Bing Chat, so that does this job of linking to like resources on the web that it has curled in order to come up with the response. And what's hilarious is I asked it to write an argument for why learning styles are so important, despite the fact that all research sort of debunks it. And it cited a web page on Vanderbilt's site, which was actually debunking learning styles. But in order to debunk something, you have to describe it first. So it grabbed the description part of it and used it to create its response. It's just kind of interesting to play with this stuff. Any last quick comments, Ariel, Norman, before we introduce the next episode? And I have some housekeeping updates that I wanted to give. Anything that we didn't cover that we wanted to talk about?
Could just, reading from the comments, a quick shout out to Jim Goodall and the Icicle work that's happening. We're really excited to be hosting the conference on learning engineering this summer at CMU. And that's going to be happening at the same time as our annual Learn Lab Summer School. So if you've got any reason to come visit Pittsburgh in the summer, this is it. We're also going to be having a special track at Summer School that will introduce Smart Sparrow style, ETX style authoring in the Taurus environment. So it's the first time we'll be able to do that. We're excited.
Cool. Thank you. Ariel?
No, just thank you very much for inviting us here. It's been fun. And, I got to learn a little bit more yet about Norman. So it's always good.
Well, thank you all. So next week, we begin our sort of 2-episode celebration of 3 years of this webinar. So I don't know, Ariel, Norman, if you know, this started 3 years ago when the pandemic was just starting with an email from Zhao, and we started meeting every Saturday, and it has gone on. So we are like 143 episodes in.
Wow.
One thing we did not do
Crazy.
was early on was we did not convert this into a podcast. So everything remained on like YouTube videos and the Silver Lining for Learning website. But there is a team of people who have been working in the background very diligently over the past few months, setting up the infrastructure to take all our past episodes and make them available on any sort of podcasting platform. 30 plus episodes are actually on there. And next week, we will begin our celebration of 3 years with our guests who are Tox Bakare, Leanne Doherty, Ragini Lal, and Annie Nam, who have been working very hard in the background. And in fact, at this point in time, maybe more conversant with the episode because things have blurred in my head for sure over the past 3 years because they've been listening to these episodes along the way. So really excited to have them on the show. And sort of just excited about the fact that we are 3 years into this completely unfunded, from the seat of the pants webinar/podcast. And yes, it's at a special time. It is at noon Eastern next Saturday, March 18th. All the information is already on the website.